he is one of the best drummers to come out of England during the late 1970s. Drummer for the amazing band The Jam during that time, Mr. Rick Buckler. Rick, how are we doing today?
I'm fine. How's things?
Wonderful, Rick. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule. I know you're busy there in London, and thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule just to be a part of the show.
Oh, no, it's great. It's a pleasure.
And so I know you grew up there in England, and who were your musical gods like when you were listening growing up there in England?
I suppose I took a lot of influences from my older brothers in what they were listening to, because they were much more turned on to things like the Rolling Stones and them and the Beatles and what have you. But when I started to play drums, I started seeking out the good drummers, if you like. So then I started to listen to, you're talking about the early 1970s sort of period. So bands like Deep Purple were sort of emerging, and Led Zeppelin were coming up, and they seemed to have the best drummers for what I can recall. And a lot of my peers were, that's the sort of thing that they were listening to. So that's pretty much where I sort of, looked for finding, really great drummers to listen to. I needed some, some education, if you like, and that's where I looked for it.
Wonderful. And I know, Rick, the band The Jam was a totally different sound. Rather than, rejecting the influential sounds of the 1960s R&B revolution that was going on, you guys incorporated it into your signature sound. I mean, there were other bands in the UK that were a part of the punk scene, and you guys were also part of that, but you guys were so different in a very good way. I mean, with your tailored suits and your signature sound. How did you guys all meet up?
We all basically went to the same school, and it sort of moved from there, really, that we wanted to play live, and there was quite a lot of clubs around the area where we could play at weekends and what have you. So that sort of thing threw us together, really, at school, and then moving on to working, playing a lot of the sort of the social clubs and that sort of thing. I mean, most of the things we played were covers of like the Kinks numbers and Beatles numbers. That was the way that we could get work, and we didn't really write a great deal of our own material in the very early days. That sort of evolved later on. But that's really where we started off, was at school.
Rick, how did you guys get signed to Polydor Records in 1977?
Well, we decided that we couldn't carry on playing the clubs outside of London, because although we were being paid quite well, London was really where the scene was happening. There was a great sort of pub rock scene happening there. So we decided to go and play, in those sort of clubs. And a lot of the bands that were around there, the Police and the Stranglers, and not just the punk bands, but there was a lot of other bands playing around that scene. And I think what the punk thing did was it brought all of that sort of live music to the front, and the record companies were really sort of looking around for. I think they realised that there was something exciting happening. So it drew all of their attention towards all the bands who were on that scene, and of course we were one of them. And we had several record companies looking at us, much like all the other bands on that scene. But Polydor got in there first. I think it was just that's all it was. It could have been any one of the record companies, but they got there first.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's the background, Rick, on the band's debut single, In the City?
That one was the one, I suppose, that really stuck out for most people as the first one that we should release. And I think because we had come from out of the town, we'd come from out of the city, out of London, and we're basically had thrown ourselves into the middle of London, and I think with all the excitement that London held for us, I think it was just a great anthem for what we were doing at that time.
And Rick, did you feel that the second studio album, This Is the Modern World, felt kind of rushed there in the studio, in your opinion?
It was, some people say that they thought it was a bit rushed, but I mean, the first album was cool because we'd been rehearsing for that for about 5 years, but when it came to the second album, we pretty much wrote most of it in the studio, which was a new experience for us. So there was a very steep learning curve in that respect. I mean, I always look back on that album with great fondness, but I don't think it was quite what the record companies expected to find coming out of the band, out of the Jam at that time.
I totally agree. I mean, each album had its own, story behind it, and the studio album, Setting Suns, was that originally intended as a concept album, and the Ed and Rifles, was that a song about class warfare?
I don't know whether it was intentionally set out that way. I mean, it certainly started to look that way because I think what Paul was writing about was sort of, politics with a small p, about what, the class divide between the people who went to Eton and Cambridge and eventually went on to sort of rule the country, if you like, because of their position of power. It certainly took on the feel of a concept album, but I wouldn't say that it was an intentional thing that we did, from the outset when that album was being put together. No.
Okay, all right. And the Jam's first number one hit was a tune called "Going Underground," and was that inspired by the British, conservative government that was going on at that time?
I wouldn't have thought so. I mean, I don't think we were that inspired by politics in general at that time. I mean, I think we found politics to be sort of a distant sort of you know what I mean. It didn't really feel like it was part of the real world. I mean, there we were sort of like most people of our age at that time, feeling quite disenchanted with the way the country was. There were strikes, there was all sorts of things going wrong, and people sort of rebelling against everything. So I don't know whether it was directly, attributable to any sort of influence, but I don't know. I mean, I think it's easy to sort of look back and say that, oh yeah, that was this, that was the reason for this, that, and the other. But at the time, it didn't really feel like that. I think it was just us making representations on how we felt, especially Paul felt about things,
The number one hit "Start" was that really based on the Beatles' Taxman single? Because I know the bass ripped and the guitar ripped and all that stuff.
I don't know. All I'll say about that is we've all got our influences, man. You know what I mean? So I mean, you could say that, but when you actually stand them next to each other, they're not that close. But I think you can see they've come from a similar sort of stable. I think that's about, I wouldn't say we were trying to rip anybody off.
No.
Or whatever. But I think that you could see that there might be a Beatle influence there somewhere.
And I always loved the song. I mean, the big hit here in the States that I remember growing up was a town called Malice, which was basically inspired by, all the unemployment that was going on there in the UK and London during the 1980s. Was that the inspiration for that song?
Yeah, I think it probably was. I mean, and I think musically we it's obviously a hark back to, the Motown feel and that sort of thing. So, but we obviously had the edge on it, which was, coming out of the lyrics. So, I mean, I think that was probably one of our, most commercially successful songs in any case.
And the tune "Precious," the Jam became the first since the Beatles to perform both tracks of a double side, 45, so to speak, on the BBC pop music show, Top of the Pops. What was that experience like for you personally, Rick?
Well, it was great because, I mean, at the time we didn't think much about it, but soon after doing it, we did sort of realise that sort of thing doesn't happen every day. I mean, there haven't been many acts that could say they played both sides. I mean, we had it as a double A side, so what the BBC normally did was they say, well, you can't have a double A side as far as the BBC are concerned. You're going to have to pick one track, and I suppose they must have liked us or something, but they actually let us play both, which soon after the event, I think it was a real honour that they actually did that. I think because normally they're quite sticklers about that sort of thing. But yeah, that was great, really, to be able to do that. I mean, it gave us two slots on a show that was big at the time. In the UK. I mean, everybody watched Top of the Pops for what was happening, in the UK charts. So yeah, it was a great honour, really.
In 1983, I know the Jam broke up, and then you joined up with Jimmy, Danny, Ray, and Martin to form Time UK. How did that great lineup all come about?
That came about because one of the A&R guys at Polydor put me in touch with Jimmy Edwards, and Jimmy Edwards he was a sort of solo artist, songwriter, and he'd done a cover version of In the City, like an acoustic version. And I sort of knew him because he did some musical arrangements and what have you for Sham 69 that were also on Polydor at that time. So it sort of grew from me and him meeting up, and then getting some other members together with the band. There's Danny Casto from Tom Robinson Band. There's Nick South, who actually lives in California now, believe it or not. He had been in several bands like Sniff and the Tears, and we recruited him as a bass player. So we had all this sort of quite a mix of different people from different backgrounds in Time UK. I mean, I've really found that to be quite enlightening, because I worked with only two guys for the previous 10 years, and then to sort of find myself with these other great musicians was absolutely fabulous. To have that chance to do that. I really enjoyed my time in Time UK. I thought we did some really good things, but I don't know if you remember back then. In the sort of mid '80s, things were going very much over to electronic music and keyboards and what have you. So we did find ourselves sort of out on a limb a little bit, but still, I enjoyed it nevertheless.
Rick, how did you guys come up with the band's debut hit single, The Cabaret?
I think that we just really felt that was probably one of the strongest songs, from performing live, and it just seemed to be the one to choose, really. I think it had been released once before, and hadn't done particularly well, under a different, I think it was with Master Switch, a band Master Switch that Jimmy was in, had released it, but it hadn't really sort of, done particularly well. So, but we thought that we had done it justice. So, like I say, I just think it was just one of the songs that we thought was the strongest one to go with. So we did,
And I know, Rick, at one point you kind of stepped away from the music business, but now I hear you're doing a lot of producing for other great artists. And tell me about the new band If.
Yeah, I was. I did a thing last year with a lot of other different musicians which I've not worked with before. There was Ian Whitewood, because there was two drummers in If, and there was Ian Whitewood, who was the drummer with Sham 69, and there was a guitarist who was with a band called Long Tall Shorty. There was myself, obviously, and Tim V, who he was sort of taken over from Jimmy Percy as singer with Sham 69, and we just decided to sort of put some songs together and take them out on the road. And we did about 8 or 9 shows, which was was a really good experience. I've never been in a band where there's been another drummer there, so we had a lot of fun with that. But it was just a project that we got involved in, and I don't really know whether we'll go back to it, but it certainly was very interesting to do at the time.
Rick, what else are you personally working on these days?
I mean, at the moment, I've sort of gone back to, I had a period of managing a band called the Highliners, which I still do manage, but I sort of decided that I was going to take on some other artists as well. So at the moment, I'm working with a young girl called Sarah Jane. She's a singer-songwriter, but she's got the most fabulous voice, and we've just finished recording about 6 songs of hers, which we're hoping to get out before Christmas, around December. So this is a real early thing for her. This is her first release, and I've been getting her some shows around the sort of south of England and what have you. And she's going down a storm. She's because she's fresh, and she's got this like I say, she's got this fabulous voice. I mean, I hopefully you'll hear of her in the States quite soon. Because it just seems to me that she's because she's so talented. I'm just really trying to help her on her way through her musical career.
Absolutely. Mr. Rick Buckler, thank you so very much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.